kind of lending criteria? So credit scores, do they have to be at a certain limit, or is it like going to a bank looking for a loan? Only the criteria is reduced.
Yes. And it's a little easier than the bank.
Easier, yeah. So why aren't people availing of this? Do people know about it?
They don't.
And who would they contact if they wanted a loan to fix up?
Right now, it's going to be Neighborhood Works in Quincy. It's going to take us about a week to get the process. By the time you take your vote, you give the chairman permission to sign the contracts. After the number of contracts that have to be signed get signed, and I turn them in, then I have to go and meet with them and come up with a contract that is acceptable to Neighborhood Works, the town of Milton, and to South Shore.
Right.
Now,
in a town like Milton, where, you know, probably the vast majority of the people that are going to qualify for are going to be elderly people on fixed incomes
Yes.
that are still in their house and, you know, can sometimes be house poor, you know, and the Council on Aging could be an excellent place to
That's a good point.
disseminate that kind of information.
So if you're elderly and you need a new roof on your house, you can qualify potentially.
Potentially.
If you need windows in your house, if you need it insulated, you can apply for this loan
Yes,
versus going to a bank and paying a higher interest rate.
yes.
We need to get this out.
But you do need to understand that it's not just, I need a new roof, I want to apply for the new roof. It's they bring the inspector in, and I have to bring your entire house up to code. So if you need a new electric service, it's in there. So the roof that was, I'm making a number, $10,000, by the time you walk away, maybe $40,000 because I had to go and do something to the electrical, I had to do something to the plumbing.
But maybe
I had to
not.
get a new- Maybe not.
Right.
Maybe not.
I mean-
It's just that that's the reason that more people don't use it, is because that short bill turns into a big bill.
Understood. But at the beginning, we say when you apply for a loan and an inspector goes out,
Yep.
he's going to tell you, you need more than a
Yes.
roof, ma'am. You need to bring your electric.
Yes.
At that point, you can back out.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So we need to get this out. This is a great program. There's a lot of money there for especially the elderly.
We,
And especially,
Some money. It
you
doesn't sound
do
like
that,
it's a
and I'm coming
lot.
back to you.
There's not, yeah, there's usually a limit on the amount of the
Going
loan.
to need to grow.
you're 50 what?
This, what I asked for initially was $50,000 to be added into this,
Yeah.
Okay.
into this. If it does get out there and it does get lots of people showing interest in it, I'm coming back to you for an increase in what we've put in here. So it'll go from 50, it'll go to whatever that new number is.
Right.
But understand, we have up to 136 in our.
So it's a limited supply of money, but
It's a limited supply.
once it's loaned out, you can't loan it out again until you get the loan
Right.
repaid.
So again, Bill, if anybody watching this program wants to talk, can they talk to you about it at the beginning? And then you'll steer them in the right direction?
Yes.
Okay.
You can actually talk to Tim, too. I brought him yesterday to get him up to speed with this so that he'll have it by the end of next week. He'll be just as versed in it as I am.
This is an important program, I think, for the, in particular for the elderly in town, that probably would not qualify for a loan at a regular bank.
I know we have a few people in town now that Neighborhood Works is working on, get the lead out. So they're doing lead abatement on their house. And it's, again, very low interest rate.
Right.
And they needed the lead removed from their house anyways.
Well, not everybody will have lead removed unless it's,
No, but
you know, but
that's one of the
windows and roofing and insulation and
Yep.
things that the elderly need, you know, that's,
So would someone like to make a motion?
Yeah, I'll make a motion to approve participation in the South Shore Home Consortium Housing Rehabilitation Program and to use a portion of the town's allocated home program funds.
I'll second that.
Any further discussion on this? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.
Good job, Bill.
Okay, we have, let's take the Swift Hat House Committee charge next so that we can cover the firefighter medical override and the budget discussion together. The Swift Hat House, we talked about this a little bit last week. There haven't been any changes to that draft charge since last week's meeting, but I wanted to recommend to the board that we defer this to a future date for a couple of reasons. One is I had a conversation with a member of the planning board, Emily Innes, over the weekend, and she suggested that we may want to consider looking at the Milton Landing as a whole, rather than just the Swift Hat House, and that's something for us to think about, because we know we have to go for an RFP on the yacht club with the park commissioners anyway, and there has been talk about trying to see what could be done to revitalize that area, maybe see how the high school crew team might make better use of it. In speaking with the town planner, who just stepped out of the room this morning, he had some ideas consistent with what's in the master plan for the Milton Village area, and one of the goals of the master plan is to try to connect the two business districts at Central Ave and
Yep.
Milton Village. And since we have an existing Central Ave Milton Village Revitalization Committee, and I don't know how active or inactive they may be at this time, but one of Bill's ideas was that maybe we consider asking the Revitalization Committee to take part in looking at the landing area, including the Swift Hat House, and broadening it a little bit. So I thought this might be something we might want to put off to one of the February meetings and give a little bit of thought in the meantime to
Yeah, I'll put it
whether
off.
a bigger scope.
Got a couple of concerns and a couple of, I mean, well, first of all, the Central Ave Revitalization Committee, I don't think I'd want to see that whole committee take on this charge, because I want to see some people historic and, you know,
Yep,
so.
that's one factor,
But
yep.
perhaps some people from that committee may be good appointees to this
Yes.
committee. I think it's a great idea to look at the whole area. I'm concerned, though, that I don't want to lose focus on the main thing at hand, which is the historic preservation of an
Yeah,
asset.
and I don't think any of us do, but we have to keep in mind, there is opposition to moving the Swift Hat Shop to the Adams Street and Wharf Street
I
location.
understand.
So, you know, there's not,
But those same people also want to preserve the house, so.
some of them do. There are people who don't think the house is worth preserving, but as a board, we've said we would like to try to preserve it, so.
Did Emily mention when they may actually take a look at the whole 88 Wharf area? Because I think it's a great idea that we should hold off for a little bit and
Well,
and take the whole,
It's something that we actually were
Everything
talking
down
about
there.
last August, September, when we went on the site walk. And then we've kind of focused on the Swift Hat Shop.
It's a little
Since
tricky, because
then-
we don't control that property for the
No,
most
so
part.
we
The park
want to do
department
this in
does.
conjunction with the park commissioners, and we'd be working with them on the RFP for the
Right.
yacht club
Understood, yeah.
anyway. So
Right.
those are just some suggestions, because we haven't revised the charge since last week. I know you had a suggestion, or maybe it was a question, Tom, about whether a committee could put out some kind of a, I forget what term you used for it, but something like an RFP, not really an RFP, but,
Yeah, just feelers for getting ideas for potential uses, because, and it's really an idea that I think Ned Corcoran gave me, that he had done it on, I think, a development in Wellesley someplace, but, rather than having a committee trying to think about things in a vacuum, not knowing whether those ideas have any commercial possibility because nobody wants to do them, let's hear from people outside who's interested and what do you think?
yeah. Yeah, so it seemed like it might be a good idea, rather than having a long discussion about it tonight, since we have the budget and some other things
Right.
on the agenda, to talk with the town planner and others, maybe get some input from the planning board on whether we should look at the landing area more broadly than just the Swift Hat Shop.
Yeah, I mean, as long as we don't put it off too long, I'm fine with that.
Okay.
we also can't forget the developer of this building, the guy who owns the building.
Right, and he's been working with the condominium and townhouse committee,
Right.
going to some of their meetings, and I think that process has a big impact on where we might wind up with the Swift Hat Shop, so.
Right. I know he's cooperating, but the bottom line is he has the right to get a permit to demolish it tomorrow, if he wants. We don't want that. We want to save it, but, so I would encourage whoever's going to be doing this is to keep the developer in mind as well.
Right. And keep in mind, too, that if it does get incorporated into a development, if that's the way it finally winds up, our concern, or I'm sure from a historic standpoint, you want to preserve the outside shell of the building as is. So you don't want it to look totally different than the historic building that was there, just for sake of making a housing project out of it.
Right.
So I think we want the planning director to really kind of take the lead on some of that discussion. But, so are we in agreement that we'll put this off until a future date and then come back and consider where we are on this?
Yeah.
Okay, so then moving on to the, I think we should take these together because they are related. The FY16 budget discussion and the firefighter medical override. So let me just give a brief, we talked about this a little bit at our meeting last week, but just since that time, the school committee's taken a vote, and we have the chair of the school committee who's here in the audience if we want to discuss the school's view on this with Leroy Walker. He's here to talk with us. The warrant committee's in a meeting tonight, so it might have been helpful if we had the warrant committee chair here as well, but obviously it's a busy time of year for them, and they have a lot of meetings at this time of the year. But just to kind of sum up where we are on this. During the holidays, I was talking with Ted Hayes, the warrant committee chair, because the school department at that point had already been in to present their budget to the warrant committee in December. Our budgets have only recently started being presented, and most of them have not yet been presented to the warrant committee. So I think we, on the non-school side, are a little bit behind not behind schedule, but we hadn't had a full discussion with the warrant committee at that point as to where they were at. We had seen a couple of their early drafts of a budget spreadsheet, but in talking with the chair of the warrant committee, this is around somewhere between Christmas and New Year's, he happened to mention that what the situation was with the schools, that the warrant committee had asked the schools to come up with a list of cuts for $1 million in cuts. And I thought it might be a good idea if the warrant committee chair and I sat down and I asked him just to bring me up to speed on where things were at. And the town administrator joined us, and the school committee chair joined us, and the town accountant, a couple of other members of town management and the school management, just to have a general discussion about the budget and what's the outlook. You know, it's hard enough to get to so many meetings. We can't get to every warrant committee meeting to know what their thinking was. So Ted Hayes gave us an update on what the current revenue projections are, we all know that the availability of free cash was just under $3 million. We talked in general about what the state of the budget as the warrant committee had in mind in late December, what that would mean for the schools and the town side, and what kind of cuts we'd be talking about. We had some discussion about overrides. The last override was in 2009 for the fiscal 10 budget. Tom, you were the warrant committee chair at the time, so you remember that well. But prior to that time, the town had really had operating overrides every 3 to 4 years or so, at least for a period leading up to that time. There had been more frequent overrides. Now, since 2009, we all know what the state of the global economy has been. We had the crash in 2008, we went through the Great Recession. It's been tough times for a lot of people and for municipalities. Some of the things that saved us were the federal stimulus dollars that we got. We had a lot of savings in insurance for a couple of years, which helped carry us through. So we've gone for a longer period of time between an operating override and another operating override than we had in some prior years leading up to the 2009 override. But there was discussion among the small group that was there that overrides take time to build an educational campaign for. And because it had been a longer period of time, there will probably need to be a greater explanation to residents as to what the state of the town's finances are and why we would, why we may need to seek an operating override. So that's really, it was a generalized discussion, and the warrant committee chairman after that meeting put together a spreadsheet that everyone has of scenarios A through F. There was some discussion about whether we should use free cash, which we all know is one-time money. And in recent years, the town has gotten away from using free cash for operating budgets. If you go back to the early 2000s, the town was using free cash to plug operating budgets every year, almost. And I think that went well back into the 90s and beyond. So there was some discussion about whether, with just under $3 million in free cash, whether it might make sense to put some of that into operating expenses if we had a long-term plan. Not something that I think everyone who was at the table recognized. It's not something we normally would do because it's not recurring money. But if the idea were to take a 2-year approach, and so what came out of that conversation was if we had an approach for the 16 budget, which is being prepared now, to not have an operating override that year, but to use some free cash for operating expenses, with the plan that there would be an operating override for fiscal 17. So we're talking in the spring of 2016 would be an override question. Then we could stave off an override for another year. We'd use some free cash to make ends meet and to have this operating budget work for fiscal 16. Again, everyone recognized not the ideal situation and not what you would do without a strategy for the following year, because you have to replace that money, you have to roll it forward. So the warrant committee chair, I believe he met with the town accountant and they spent a lot of time on these different scenarios. He produced this chart that has 6 scenarios, starting with two versions of an override in columns A and B, going out to just funding contractual obligations. There's a few other scenarios here, but what Ted Hayes, the warrant committee chair, reported back was that the warrant committee had had a discussion about this spreadsheet, and that a slim majority of the warrant committee wanted to seek an operating override in this spring for the fiscal 2016 budget. But that if the elected bodies didn't want to support an operating override at this time, the warrant committee would recommend column E, which is funding contractual obligations plus about $600,000. And I know everyone's had an opportunity to look at this worksheets of scenarios. So it does incorporate. Do you have a copy of it?
It's sideways, I can't
You
read.
just right-click.
I can give you this one if you want the
Right-click here,
paper.
Tom.
I can do it up here.
All right.
You rotate.
It's not open in Adobe, it's in Acrobat.
But column E contemplates using free cash for recurring operating expenses.
Okay.
The other piece of this would be, is this board has talked about a number of times previously, and I think many of the viewers and certainly all the town meeting members know, we had a firefighter a number of years ago, I think back in 2007,
7.
who had a very catastrophic, very serious injury on the job, and the town is legally obligated to pay his medical expenses. So the town's practice had been, for a number of years, to borrow to pay those expenses, and there was some opposition. I remember Rick Neely getting up at a town meeting and really urging the warrant committee, the selectmen at the time, town meeting, to not continue that practice, but to come up with either fund it through the operating budget or to pursue an override for it, which is different than an operating override. So we've gotten legislation. Town meeting had approved that. The legislation was approved by the state for an override for the firefighter medical expenses, which would, if this is passed by the voters, it would be capped at $500,000, and that would recur every year until it's no longer needed. And at that time, then the authorization for the $500,000 override would go away. So the discussion that we've had, we had even talked last summer, I think, about putting a question on the November ballot for the firefighter medical override. That wasn't an option for us because of timing. The issue would be, should we put that forward in April on the town election ballot as an override question before the voters at this time, so that this year we would seek the override for the firefighter medical expenses, put forward a budget to town meeting not based on an operating override, but based on using free cash, one-time money, to fund recurring operating expenses, although I know the schools in particular and some of our departments, I think the town administrators, looking to identify as many one-time expenses as we can to incorporate into what the free cash would be applied to. And then to go through a period of time where we'd have discussions at town meeting and then before PTOs and at other board meetings where we would explain the state of the budget to the voters and to town meeting members. And we'll start that with the 5-year financial forecast, which we're planning to do in
Early February.
early February. So the school committee last week had a discussion about this, and they voted to support budget scenario in column E.
And that's what your working group approved as well, right?
I wouldn't even call it a working group. It was just a meeting of a couple of board chairs and some of the town management trying to work with the warrant committee to get an understanding of where they were coming from, what the warrant committee was thinking for the, please come up and join us, Mr. Walker, what the warrant committee was thinking of for this year's budget, and it was really just an open dialogue. But the warrant committee is recommending column E if the decision by the elected boards is not to put an override question before the voters this spring. And the school committee voted this, and Leroy can probably tell us about their discussion.
I just wanted to provide a little more detail on that, because the school committee took 3 very important votes last Wednesday evening. The first was to, as Katie has alluded to support a 2-year plan, which included the warrant committee's scenario E, support for a Pickens override on the ballot this spring, and a general override on the ballot in the spring of 16. It voted as well to submit to the Selectmen 5-year financial projections, and it voted to approve $500,000 in reductions to the fiscal 16 budget.
And Leroy, the $500,000 in cuts you voted is equivalent to, I guess, about 7 or 8 positions?
8 positions. There are some very dramatic cuts. They're going to be difficult. We begin our briefings for the PTO next week.
That's right.
And we acknowledge that while we voted some specific cuts, the purpose of the meetings with the PTOs and the briefings for the PTOs is to get their input and their feedback. So we've committed to make $500,000 in cuts, but we certainly will listen to what they have to say, and the content of that list may change.
So the warrant committee, having had I understand it was a fairly lengthy discussion that they had when they came up with, but with, we'll just call it column E, what their proposal is. They're now asking the elected boards to advise them as to what our position is on whether to follow a 2-year strategy, as Leroy just talked, and as the school committee has already voted, or to seek an operating override this year. So that's what's really before us for discussion tonight. They're waiting to hear, they've heard from the school committee, they're waiting to see what the Board of Selectmen's view on this is.
What were those 2 options again, Katie?
Override or this?
An override, an operating override this spring,
Yep.
or a scenario that's a 2-year approach with a firefighter medical override this year and an operating override next year, meaning the spring of 16 for the fiscal 17 budget.
Mm-hmm.
And using free cash, using a fair amount of free cash this year in the fiscal 16 budget.
Okay.
And the thinking on the operational override this year was that we have a very short amount of time to do the education that's necessary. Presenting to the town a 2-year plan gives us 2 town meetings, the May town meeting and the fall town meeting, to do education for a ballot question which appears next spring. We thought that was a more effective, strategic and effective plan, because I think this is going to take some education. As Katie said, it's been a while since there's been an override, and we talked a lot about the use of free cash. Normally, that's not something we would do. We wouldn't use as much as this proposes, but similar to the use of free cash, the other legitimate concern is overrides and our ability to pass overrides. That's something that's been factored into our bond rating, and it would be much more damaging if we go for an override and it doesn't pass. So our thought is do the education that we need to. And I think we're presented with a unique opportunity, which is that the leadership of the town could present the residents and, more importantly, the taxpayers with a 2-year plan that says we have a longer-term vision of how we will get this done, and we will avoid the dramatic cuts that would affect the quality of life and the level of service that we're able to offer. And we have a plan that would allow us to get the override approved that we need. So I would urge you to unanimously support the plan that the
And let me mention just one other factor that came up in the discussions, and that is that and as Joe Lynch has told us at a number of meetings, there is an unfunded mandate coming in the form of the stormwater management program. And it's not going to hit in 16, it really would hit in 17. And we're looking at potentially $800,000 that will need to be funded for stormwater. So that would present itself at the same time as the second year of a 2-year plan. And so that was part of the thinking as to why it might make sense not to seek an override this year, as well as the length of time that, in particular, the school representatives felt that we need a longer period of time for an educational campaign. That I think that's right, but that largely generated with the school representatives. But the other piece of it is that we know that there's this looming unfunded mandate coming from DPW, and it might make sense to time an override with that.
Right. So just a general question. I agree with the 2-year strategic plan. I think it's a great idea to give us time to go out to the public and basically sell an override.
Right.
Would part of the reason for doing this 2-year strategic plan be so that we don't have 2 overrides in 1 year? Is that what we're trying to avoid here, like the Pickens override plus the general budget override?
I think we need certain, and for people watching when we say Pickens, that it's really, it's
The
the
firefighter,
firefighter,
yeah.
medical, or public safety, I think it's even
Public
called the public
safety
safety
personnel.
overall.
Right,
override.
but we all know what it's for, yeah.
So we need certainty with that. We need to know whether that will pass, because if that goes on the ballot and the voters don't fund it, then we're looking at up to $500,000 in a given year that's going to have to be funded out of the operating budget, and that will mean cuts among other departments. So we need some certainty. We need to know if that will pass. And if it does, then it frees up some potential. Right now, the scenario E has about $300,000 of free cash being used for the firefighter medical expenses. So if I keep saying operating, but if the firefighter medical override passes on the April ballot for the firefighter medical expenses, then that frees up $300,000 under column E, which can be applied for other purposes, whether it's roads, whether it's capital, whether it's, the warrant committee will weigh in on, I'm sure departments will want to put in requests for that, but.
That kind of brings me to my next question. Sorry, Leroy, did I cut you off?
No, I was just going to say, as Tom knows, there's a long list of competing priorities for the free cash, including
Exactly.
capital.
So that actually leads into my next question. So historically, and a lot of warrant committee members here, do we use free cash to fund operating expenses over the past number of years? Have we used, what percentage of the free cash would we have used for operating expenses?
In recent years, the policy is no. In past years, which I consider very misguided, they did.
They did.
Very misguided, but yes.
It was really under, when Emily Ennis was the chair of the warrant committee really started moving away from that. And when she was warrant committee chair, that's when those 9C cuts happened in the middle of January, and we had to scramble, and they had to use. But going back before that, going back to the early 2000s, the 90s, free cash and overlay reserve funds were put into operating expenses to plug holes and to try to stave off overrides. So the warrant committee and the town's management, I think all the elected boards, have really moved away from that in recent years. And Tom said last week that he doesn't agree with this proposal, and I understand where he's coming from, because having sat on that warrant committee, you don't want to use one-time money for operating expenses. I think what's different here, which is why I would support this 2-year plan, is because we're not just going into it and saying we're going to use $1.5 million or $2 million of free cash this year, and then who knows what's going to happen next year. We're going into it with a plan, which would be that we would know we would have to go to the voters for an operating override next year. And as Leroy said, Amy Dexter, our town accountant, has been quoting Standard & Poor's on a call recently, saying that they view a failed override as worse than using free cash for operating expenses if the use of that free cash for operating is tied to a strategy or a plan. So that's the only reason that I would support this, but I think all the school committee chair, the warrant committee chair, and the town accountant and the town management are proposing here.
From my standpoint, it's no different than the guy that can't afford the car this year, but says, maybe next year I'll get a raise. So that's my plan. I'm going to get a raise next year. That's what we're doing. That's exactly what we're doing. And what if we don't get the raise? That's not a strategy as far as I'm concerned. It's playing with fire, I think. And we're potentially, because you're using $1 million to plug the budget, which won't be there next year. You got a $2.4 million shortfall. I mean, and then you're talking about another 800. You're potentially talking about a 2017 override that could be astronomical. And that's my fear, that it's just going to be so big that you're going to have to make some serious cuts in 17 just to get an override pared down that's somewhat palatable.
So Tom, in your opinion, would you...
I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole.
You wouldn't touch the free cash
No.
for operating expenses?
No, not at all.
So
We're foregoing capital projects to do it, and we'll never get that money back again.
right.
And I hear you on that, Tom, and that's an important consideration. I think what we have to keep in mind, and kind of why I'm where I am on this is, the warrant committee, they're an appointed committee, and I remember in our years on the committee, we always used to talk about the fact the warrant committee is not a political body. Their role is to really be the numbers people and to look at the numbers and make a recommendation at town meeting based on the right financial analysis. We as a Board of Selectmen and the school committee is another elected board, and town meeting, that's the political context.
Yeah.
And I think if we were to go in and say, we want to put $2.9 million of free cash into the Affordable Housing Trust, which is a big priority. I mean, we've all been pushing that. Roads, which I know is another big priority. Different capital projects, those are so needed. But I think it would be really hard to get town meeting to put $3 million of free cash into those things and cut 18 teachers out of the school budget and have the schools reduce their budget by $1 million. I don't think that politically would sell at town meeting. And that's the risk that we would run, is that we'd have town meeting members on the floor saying, trying to take money from from a recommendation under one article for capital and move it into the school budget or move it into the police budget or whatever budget would have some big cuts. So I think, as much as I understand where you're coming from, and I get the financial analysis and the problem with using one-time money in the absence of a strategy, I think we have to take into account the political realities that we're facing at town meeting. If we use free cash for roads and capital and projects, and we don't try to do something to lessen the impact on the schools and on our departments, because there are requests that our police and fire and other departments have that are not going to be funded this year because we don't have the funds. So the warrant committee, I think, has given this a lot of thought, and I know that their initial thinking was that the warrant committee recommended an override last year, and we held that off. We're in a situation where we've had free cash of about $2 million for the last 3 years. And some people think that it's hard to sell an override when you have a large free cash number. Now, we know theoretically we should be able to go out to all the unions and the town meeting members and the employees and say free cash is one-time money, it should go to capital, it should go to roads. But we're at the end of it's 6 years since our last operating override. We're in a period where we've been cutting budgets and really trying to be as tight as we can be for a while. And the strong feeling from the schools, and I think they're probably right, is that a longer period of time is needed to make the case.
We've done operating overrides in this kind of time frame.
I agree, and I brought that up at the meeting, but
The one we did back in 2009 was roughly in this kind of time period.
but that also,
$3.4 million override.
but don't forget, it also followed, I remember this pretty well, it followed the 2008 town meeting, where the warrant committee went in with 2 budgets, including a contingent budget, and town meeting rejected it. So, and that was really the same thing, I think, in '06, that it was preceded by the case being made at the prior town meeting that we're really at the point where we think we need to go out for another operating override.
I don't recall it being rejected. Didn't the selectmen
I
pull
think
it? Someone
No,
pulled
but
it.
the warrant was already in print, and I remember having to stand up there as warrant committee chair at the
Yeah.
time and say, and recommend the contingent budget, and we kept getting shot down on every article. But the message got to town meeting members that the warrant committee that's looking at the finances was recommending an operating override, and that probably paved the way for the '09 override.
I think 2 things are important. I think it's important to think about and talk about, from a fiscal policy standpoint, what makes sense and why that's important. And I do think it's important. But the second thing that I also think we need to consider is that from the taxpayer's standpoint, if we go for an override this year, we're asking them to raise their taxes in a year where we have $2.9 million in free cash. That's a hard ask. So we can all offer our opinions about whether or not they would be willing to do that, but let's assume I'm right, I don't think they will. So that gets us back to warrant committee's option C, which means that the schools take a $1.1 million cut and the town takes a $900,000 cut. And as Katie has correctly pointed out, if any of us think that from a political standpoint, the town is going to stand for either of those levels of cuts without putting pressure on us and on you to use some of that free cash, then we're all dreaming.
I think so.
It's happened over and over again. It's happened in other towns. The last one I knew, it happened in Newton, where the mayor said, I don't care what you're not going to get the free cash. You're not going to have it.
Tom?
It was like 2007 or
You
2008.
should know this even better than I. This is Milton.
I don't care what it is. I think,
Okay.
I think to plan like this is just fiscally irresponsible, and I can't be a part of it. I'm sorry.
All right, so can I ask you, Tom, so that I can see your side? Because all I'm getting is one side. Would you be in favor of using this $2.9 million for fixing roads and one-time expenses
Absolutely.
versus putting it towards...
Absolutely.
And then where would we get the money to, are you saying go for an override this year?
If need be, if we don't want to make the hard cuts, which I don't want to see anybody get laid off either,
Well,
but
correct. It's either hard cuts or go for an override this year.
That's right.
That's your plan.
I think that's all you have, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, it's still a little early in the game. We don't know what local aid is. We don't have a clue as to what it's going to be yet.
Well, the
but-
governor has
But
said pretty
let's, I
clearly.
mean, we know it's a tough year at the state level,
Yeah.
too. But
They've
we
got
don't have a
pretty-
clue,
They've got
still.
a pretty, he said pretty clearly he's not going to reduce local
Right,
aid,
yep.
but I'm
He
pretty
didn't say he
sure
was going to raise
not-
it.
Yeah.
We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know.
So it seems to me that we have a couple of options. We can do your 2-year plan and go out to the public over the next number of months and year and sell the 2-year plan, okay?
And raise the likelihood that we can get an override approved.
Correct. Or we can tell the public that we have $2.9 million in free cash. We can use a Band-Aid because that's what it really is. We're probably gone over the cliff. We just haven't fallen into the ocean yet. We can use this $2.9 million to give us a parachute and give us a soft landing into that ocean before we have a general override next year.
Right, that's exactly the pitch. This only works, taxpayers, if you approve the override. Otherwise, you'll have the same problem, as Tom's pointing out,
Correct.
in a year.
So do you want your taxes raised this year while we have 2.9 million? We could put a Band-Aid on it and
Right.
keep it the same. Or wait till next year and go out for an override and use the 2.9 million to plug.
So your override next year has to cover whatever the one-time money is you use this year, plus whatever the
Right.
inflationary increase is in the budget next year, which is going to be at least another $1 million, at least.
But-
At least.
It has to
Another- yeah.
cover, it has to cover whatever,
You got to replace the revenue that you're not going to
right,
have.
it has to cover whatever the portion of the free cash is that you use for operating,
That's correct.
which is not all of it. No one's proposing that we use 2.9 million to cover
No,
operating.
some of it is
understand.
still
Only
being
using-
applied to one-time expenses.
We're only using one
What's the
Right.
total amount that we're using?
$1,030,620.
But then next year, you're going to want to plug those one-time expenses. I mean, those one-time expenses in the short run, especially on the school side, are becoming recurring expenses because
No.
it's a longer-term
No,
plan.
that's
Well,
absolutely.
maybe Lori can speak to the
absolutely
advancement
not true.
budget for us. Because
I can, actually. We have a list, I should get back to the mic. We have a list of approximately $600,000 in advancement requests, one-time requests, and those are not recurring expenses.
But will there be an advancement request next year? I mean, I understand the one-time request, but
I don't-
are you coming back with another advancement request next year? Not maybe the same dollars, but what difference does it make? It's still an advancement.
I don't know, but now moving to our 5-year financial projections, since we took fiscal 15 as a base year, which included $500,000 in advancement, that's part of the base. So yes, maybe, but it's too early to say. the important thing to understand is this is a bottoms-up process where we use data, we look at performance of our students, and we decide what the priorities are for that given year.
Yeah,
So-
I'm not saying they're not justified, but I'm just saying that the reality of it is, you know, whether they're the same expenditures or different expenditures, there's going to be expenditures there that are going to put pressures again. And that's over and above the 1 million or 1.1 million that we're using. So yeah, it's bigger than it looks.
It is. I mean, it's 1 million that we would be putting, 1 million out of the 2.9, because, so the bulk of this is really going into one-time
Right.
expenses, but it's about 1 million of the 3 million that would
Right.
go into operating.
And then potentially you wouldn't fund your stabilization fund next year because that's all. Because the other thing they're not looking at too is we pushed our revenue projections to the limit to do this also. So, you know, there's a very good.
I actually think Amy's been pretty
has.
conservative about revenue.
What we did was we did assumptions back 5 years.
Yeah, but there's still things that are very, they're motor vehicle excise, they're fines and penalties, they're things that you really can't predict. And if you don't predict right, then that money's not there next year. You don't have the one-time money next year
But
that you're funding the stabilization funds with. So those don't get funded
Yeah,
next
no, and
year.
that varies, but the town accountant does take a conservative approach, and I know even the warrant committees has wanted to push some of those numbers, and
But
she's really held them
we're
back.
pushed up quite a bit in motor vehicle excise, and we're pushed up quite a bit in a lot of those areas to
Well,
get to this
if you compare
point.
it to the recession years.
If you compare it to
yes.
last year, we're pushed up quite a bit. So I don't buy it, I'm sorry.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that the purpose of this meeting is to have this discussion tonight.
Right.
And a debate like this is healthy to have, because there are arguments on both sides. And I guess the
Yep,
question
I
for the
understand.
board is do we, you know, looking at the political context, looking at the environment we've just come through, I think one of the other reasons, even last year, we recognized that, you know, times were still tough for people. We didn't want to go out too quickly for an operating override, recognizing we're still coming out of the Great Recession. There's still people who are, you know, whose salaries haven't increased in a number of years. There's still a lot of people who are, you know, for whom the 2.5% increase, which is not always 2.5%, but without an override, the increase in property taxes each year, it has a big impact on. So the longer we can put off an override, the better, from the point of view, especially of a retired homeowner or someone who's on a fixed income. Those are the people who are always affected the most by operating overrides. But we're really at a point where we would need to seek one this year or use a strategy like this. We're recognizing, okay, we have some funding available, we might not otherwise use it, but if we have a long-term strategy, then that's a better justification for it. And Amy has talked with Standard & Poor's about this and gotten their view of what is more serious. A failed override, and Milton has had failed overrides over the years, or using one-time money strategically. So
Yeah, I just disagree with it's necessary strategic, but.
And I get Tom's point, but
Yes.
strategically is the word, I think, that is the important word here. And I believe the 2-year plan is the strategic way to go. Because one thing I don't want, and to your words, Tom, if we don't have, probably we don't even have enough time to do an override this year, do we?
Yeah, you do.
Well, we don't have enough time to sell it,
it's
though.
been done. But
Yeah,
again,
because you got almost 6 months, you got 5.5 months.
It's a lot of
question
selling in
will
6
most likely go out in June. You could put the question on an April ballot. We've never done that. It's always
No,
been
it's
in
always
June
been
after
June.
town meeting. But
Okay.
there's been talk at times of putting it on the April ballot. So there's a few months, but
Right.
there's also, again, the issue of the stormwater unfunded mandate. There may be other things like that in other budgets that we want to consider and do some long-range planning for, and not move too quickly, but have a year to plan this out. The financial
Really is.
forecast hasn't yet been presented, so I think we need to get that to other boards. And we haven't talked with all the other independent elected boards, and
Well, true, but what I'm saying is if we risk going out this year and it fails, then we're looking at huge cuts.
And if it fails next year, the cuts are even bigger. That's,
Understood, but at least we have a year to sell it.
we have,
You know.
yes, we could do presentations at the fall town meeting as well as the May town meeting.
Education.
There's a longer period of time to get the message
I mean,
out.
to me, and I was on the school committee with Leroy, the last thing we want, in my opinion, is to lose teachers,
nobody wants to, I understand, no.
you know? I always say people are not coming to Milton because of the Board of Selectmen. They're coming here because of the schools. And they're coming here because of the security of our police force, etc. We're undermanned as it is with the police force. We can't afford to lose any more policemen or to have layoffs.
And you also have to understand we've got a very broken model, and until we really start to address our broken model.
Absolutely.
And we're not a lot different than any other towns, other than we don't have the revenue base is a little different in Milton, and it makes it more onerous for the taxpayers because of our lack of commercial. But you can't live for very long with your expenses increasing by 4% and 5%, and your revenues increasing by less than 2%.
Absolutely.
It doesn't take a genius. It doesn't even take an accountant to figure that out.
And I understand that the DOR frowns upon using free cash for operating expenses. But again, I think the word here is strategic. This is
I think so.
probably won't happen again in the next 10 or 15 years that we will use free cash for operating expenses. We just have to use it this year, I believe, just to get over this year.
Right, and the only thing I would add, and Tom, I think...
I mean, if you give me a plan to cut $1 million next year somehow, or consolidate, or figure out a way to cut it over a period of time, I could be more supportive, but
Right.
to just say that our fix is an override, and we're going to spend $1 million of one-time money this year, is just to me, I'm sorry, it's just irresponsible.
Well, actually, you go first. Laura.
Yeah, I was just about to say. Tom, I think that the interesting thing is, I agree with you that over the long term, we need to make some structural changes. There's no argument there.
Yeah, and the time is now.
Yes, and the interesting thing is, I think this presents an opportunity. It presents an opportunity for us to start that education process. But I think it's very difficult to do it if you have people focused on what they view as a deterioration in the quality of life and the level of service. If you do $1 million in cuts in the schools and $900,000 in cuts in the town, that's what they're going to be focused on. I think it's better to focus them on, we have a longer-term plan. It begins with this use of free cash, but also an override this spring and then next spring. And the reason we need to continue thinking like this is because of the structural changes that you've outlined. And I think there would be some benefit to the unanimous support of the selectmen, but I know you all have to vote your conscience.
Yeah, no, I understand too. I mean, it's.
Well, and I think the idea is that if we do have the longer period of time, we have an override election next year, and if it fails, then the voters will have spoken, and then the decision
That's
will be
right.
made at that time.
Exactly.
And we will have to live with cuts at that point. But what we're trying to do is take a temporary measure, so to speak, because it's part of a longer-term strategy. So it's a proposal. We don't have to vote to accept it, but we have had a vote by the school committee. Was it unanimous? I think it was unanimous.
It was unanimous.
By the school committee. The Warren Committee is supporting, the Warren Committee has proposed, Colleen, they want to know what our thoughts are on it. So,
And hopefully you'll vote to support it this evening, because if you do, then we can start the education process with our PTO briefing starting next week.
yeah, and you know, I guess one other thing to point out is we'd be using about $1 million for operating expenses. We're still making cuts with those. The school's still going to cut 8 positions. We're going to have some cuts to make. We're going to ask, I think the town, we don't even have to ask, the town administrator is already looking at this and coming up with recommendations that she would make for us, as to how we would handle the cuts on our side. But, you know, it would be another option to even move some of these free cash that's being used for one-time expenses further into operating and try to reduce the $500,000 in cuts. And no one's advocating that. We're trying to just use some of the free cash, it's a third of it that's available, to put into plugging some holes to try to let a 2-year strategy move forward and see whether there can be broad support for it.
And just getting back to Tom's point again, if we agree on approving this tonight, we should definitely all agree that this should not happen again, you know, using free cash for operating expenses. Would you agree with that, Tom?
Well, absolutely, it shouldn't happen now, so yeah, it shouldn't happen again either.
I
No, it's
understand.
10 or
Dennis,
15 years from now, I don't know what circumstances.
I'm a little older than you are, so I've learned never to say never.
Never say never, I know.
right.
Yeah, exactly.
I know, but, you know, at least in the near future, we shouldn't,
Well,
we should not make a habit out of it.
Not
I think
the
we agree
preferred
that it's not the optimum approach. I certainly agree with that, but as I say, I would never say never. Depends on what other options I'm faced with.
Well, maybe we shouldn't wait so long again to do an override,
That's true.
you know?
But keep in mind, the economic climate that the whole
That's
world has
right.
been in for the last few
That's
years. I
right.
mean, that was a big factor in this.
Absolutely.
So we do need, I think we would need a vote. We probably should separate them out, given the discussion tonight. I think we want to vote the firefighter medical override. We should decide as a board, and Tom, you've been one of the ones pushing, we need to make a decision on when to put this out
Yep.
on the ballot. So why don't we should we take that first and make a decision on that first, and then?
That's fine.
On the firefighter?
So the firefighter medical override, Anne Marie, did you want to say anything about the firefighter medical override? Or, I know we have in our packages,
Again, we can just kind of explain the way it works.
That would be good, actually, Tom, yeah. Versus
So what it is
versus the bond.
we went out for special legislation, for a home rule petition. Last town meeting?
2013 annual town meeting under Article 16.
So, and basically, it was a home rule petition to say, look, we have these medical expenses to deal with. We've been bonding them in the past. It's not a very good practice. It's an irresponsible practice. The debt service was getting to be pretty onerous.
We were taxing it.
So we made the decision to go out and say, we want to set up a special purpose stabilization fund for the purpose of paying these certain medical expenses. We will fund that with an override from the taxpayers. It's almost similar to a debt exclusion, but a little different, that this stabilization fund will be funded up to the amount of $500,000 with an override from the voters. The following year, as we expend the money, we will replenish that fund back up to the $500,000. So we're constantly replenishing it with whatever we spent the year before to have a pool of money to pay those medical expenses with. At the end of time, whatever is left in that account will get refunded back to the taxpayers. And the money will be invested in the meantime, too, and we'll also make a little bit of
And the
interest.
interest stays within the fund, and then it reduces the tax levy
Correct.
when the need no longer exists.
Yep.
and this is a different, this can't be included within an override, an operating override ballot question. It's a different
It's a
different
type
type.
over
of
the levy
override.
limit.
So,
Right.
because of all the
Right.
different items that you just mentioned.
Right.
So we also have tonight a copy of the current state of the account, which is projecting that we'll have a deficit of just under $300,000 at the end of this year. The current balance is projected to be about $135,000. The balance at the end of last June was $550. The estimated balance this June 30th would be $135, so we'd need to replenish it with about $300,000. That's why in scenario E, the Warren Committee has $300,000 plugged in here. So if this override does pass on the April ballot, again, that would free up some additional money in the Warren Committee's budget spreadsheet to be repurposed to something else. Is there anything else that we need to mention about the medical override? The expenses vary, obviously. The chart has, the expenses have been as high as $780,000 a few years ago to $300,000 or $400,000, well, closer to $400,000 in the last couple of years.
Mhm.
So is it the desire of the board to put this firefighter medical override on the April ballot?
Yes.
Yes. Yep.
I'll make a
Which
motion
would
to
give
that
us
effect.
certainty. So you're moving that?
Second.
Okay, so the motion is to place an override question for the firefighter medical expenses on the April 2015 ballot. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
So that one is unanimous. On the Warren Committee's request that we give them some guidance as to what we think for the budget. We have a
Schedule.
sense from our discussion as to where
Yeah.
we are.
Yeah.
So why don't I move that we support the school committee vote and recommend that the Warren Committee's budget scenario in column E be taken as the budget approach for fiscal 16, and with the idea that it would be part of a broader two-year strategy in which the board would support seeking an operating override for fiscal year 17. probably a little bit too convoluted since we don't have it written down.
Get the idea, though.
Anything else in there?
No, that was
So
good.
that was
Yeah,
it.
I'll second that.
Okay, so moved and seconded. Any further discussion?
Other than this, I'm clearly not going to support it as much as I would hate to see the diminution in services as a result of it not happening. I just think it's fiscally responsible, and I can't do it, but I'll just make that comment one more time.
And I, like I'm sure Dennis, respect Tom's views on this.
Absolutely,
And,
yeah.
and we understand the risks associated with using free cash for this purpose. I think where it's part of the broader strategy, that's what makes me comfortable with voting for this motion. Anything else?
I'm good.
Then all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And opposed?
All right.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Leroy, for joining us
Thanks, Leroy.
tonight. Okay. We are on to the demolition agreement deadline for 131 Elliott Street and 0 Central Avenue, which together comprise the Hendry's building. As everyone knows, the demolition deadline is January 31st. I've had some discussions with Stephen Connolly. I do want to recognize that Joe Prondak, our building commissioner, has been working very extensively on this with the MBTA, with the demolition contractor, with the Connollys, with many other parties. So Joe has done just yeoman's work on this, and sometimes it's not always known, because there are questions, sometimes there are things on social media, when is the Henry's building coming down? People don't realize that there's always a lot going on behind the scenes, and especially with our town administrator and with Mr. Prondak, so they've worked very hard. What I would recommend to this board is the current chair is that we have been granting 2-month extensions of this, and we know there's a number of factors involved. We still, both parties are still before the Concom for demolition applications for permits. So I think we should probably take the approach of seeking shorter-term extensions so that we can keep this moving along, but revisiting it periodically, and I did talk to Mr. Connolly about that. So if we're not meeting next week, we are meeting again on February 3rd. If we extended the demolition date until February 6th, which is a Friday, we can take it back up again at our meeting on February 3rd. And that just it's a shorter period of time, but it'll keep this coming up at our meetings a little more frequently than it has.
So this is to extend the agreement.
The deadline, under the demolition deadline under the agreement.
The building is not going to come down by the 6th. It's just we're extending the agreement till the 6th.
Yes, and the next Concom hearing is not until February 10th, so we are still before the Concom. The hearings the other night before the Concom, both for 131 Elliott and for 0 Central Ave, were continued at the request of the parties, because we're still working with the demolition contractor. And
Do we have a feel for how close we are at this point to getting?
well, Joe Prondak is working very hard.
I mean, yeah, and I understand all the complications.
Yeah.
It's not a simple matter.
No,
but-
it's not.
There's so many different.
I mean, the simple matter is everybody wants to see the building down.
Yes,
But,
and we are really working.
Connolly's are working hard, and we're working hard, I think, is probably what we can say at this point. But a shorter term, I think, would be agreeable to both parties, and we'll bring this back before us again soon.
Katie, what are we hoping to achieve on the 6th of February?
Well, that's just an early February date. The idea was just to come up with a short window of time. And I know we're not meeting next week, so our next meeting is on the 3rd. We could continue it until the 3rd, but just, if there's a snowstorm on the 3rd and we can't have a meeting, give us a few more days to build in. So it's just a short-term extension. Again, we're both before the Concom, so we don't have demolition permits yet. The town doesn't have a demolition permit yet. We haven't fulfilled all of the things that we need to do.
It's not like we're going to get one by January 31st. So
No.
Obviously not going to get one by January 31st. So.
Understood. And the next Concom meeting is February
10th, I
10th?
believe.
So
Which
why-
is a
why-
Tuesday night, which could be a meeting night for us, but because we may be at the Concom, that's not one of the nights we scheduled earlier than this meeting.
Okay. But again, I'm confused. What are we hoping to achieve on the 6th? If we're extending the agreement until the 6th, and the Concom meeting is on the 10th, why don't we extend it till after the 10th?
We could, I don't know whether we've already, town council has already done a draft for us. of the extension through January 6th, and I don't know if that's gone over to Mr. Connolly for signature or not yet.
Because all that's going to happen on the 6th is we're going to extend it again until after the Concom meeting.
And on the 3rd, we may want to extend it for a longer period of time than that. I think as we know more, as the weeks go on, when we know more, as we're making progress with the demolition contractor and with others, we'll have more information at that point.
Okay. All right.
So do we have a motion to extend the demolition deadline until February 6th, 2015?
So moved.
I'll second it.
Any further discussion? And all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, unanimous. Thank you. Number 14 is a Logan Airport environmental data response. Is Michael Blanchard joining us for this?
No.
Okay. Michael called me this afternoon. All three of us were at the Airplane Noise Advisory Committee meeting last week, and at that meeting, members of the advisory committee asked us to submit a letter that they would draft in response to an environmental report that was prepared regarding Logan Airport. It's a
Right.
very lengthy report. The Airplane Noise Advisory Committee said at that meeting that they would do the draft, they would get it to us over the weekend, Monday, Tuesday. The deadline is January 27th, so it's coming up quickly. We only found out about this last week. We heard from one member of the Airplane Noise Advisory Committee today that it's just not enough time for them to put the letter together. So we do not yet have the draft. A couple of options that they explored with Michael Blanchard, the Assistant Town Administrator, was that we could seek an extension. And Michael reached out to Massport and was told that
No way.
It's not-
there cannot be an
that's not
extension. There's
possible.
already been an extension. The other option was that we could approve the submission of a letter by the town administrator
I think
if,
that's reasonable.
but again, we don't know what's going to be in it. We don't know what level of specificity will be in this letter. The third option that they proposed, the committee proposed, was that the grassroots group submit the letter. But they recognized that it would be more,
I
have
think
greater
as long as they can
standing
get
if
it
it came
to
from the
us,
board.
as long as they can get it to us and we can give the town administrator individually our feedback before that signature, then the town administrator is certainly capable of making her own decision on whether she should support it or
we
not.
could.
It's
And
subject to town council review.
we may
as well.
want, since town council's already was here meeting with us a week or so ago, we may want to ask that they review the letter also, and that if there are things in it that we're uncomfortable with or we're just not sure we can confirm, maybe some modifications could be made to it.
Right.
So,
I'm here with
so
that.
this sounds like the second option is the one that we'd like to pursue. I think that sounds reasonable,
Yeah.
to give the town administrator the authority, if she's comfortable that it's something that should go out on town letterhead.
Yeah.
Okay, then, do we have a motion to authorize the town administrator in conjunction with town council to review the Airplane Noise Advisory Committee's draft response to the Logan Airport Environmental Data Report and an appropriate response?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We're on to the town administrator's report.
Madam Chair, we have one more item regarding a
Yes.
contract with the state. This item was added to your agenda late because we did not have knowledge of this request when the agenda was put together, but it is a time-sensitive request, so we are able to put it on your agenda this evening. And this is a contract from the state, and it's a reimbursement for the blizzard of 2013 dollars that we expended. It's approximately $142,000 reimbursement for expenses that the town of Milton incurred during that blizzard. And great amount of thanks goes out to your DPW director, who was instrumental in pulling all the other departments together to collect the information to submit the paperwork for this FEMA grant.
How much money is it, Anne Marie?
$142,000.
At the time, so that was over his budget, obviously. Where would that have been paid from at the time? And does this money go back into that account? Or?
No, this was paid out of different budgets, some police, some fire, some DPW. The money was obviously expended in 2013, so this $142,000 would be put into your general fund revenue, and it will then revert to free cash in 2017.
I see, okay.
We hope.
We hope.
We hope it'll flow to free cash, which might help us next year with the budget, Tom.
That's right.
Even if,
A little bit.
a little bit.
So I need a motion to approve the
We
FEMA
haven't-
contract.
I'll move to approve the FEMA contract that will reimburse the town for expenses incurred for emergency protective measures and debris removal associated with the February 8th and 9th, 2013 blizzard, and to authorize the town administrator to sign all pertinent paperwork on behalf of the board.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, town administrators report.
Madam Chair, I do not have a report tonight.
Okay, the only thing I wanted to report is that I did talk with Emily Ennis of the Planning Board regarding the master plan and the implementation committee that we voted to create at the October town meeting. So what Emily told me is that the Planning Board will be taking up the master plan in February. I think there's another vote for them to accept it or to have a final discussion or vote on it. And then the plan would be for Emily to come in, meet with us about the implementation committee. And we have one appointee to that committee. The Planning Board has another appointee. And then it's a 5-member committee altogether. And then, so there are 3 other members of the committee. So the idea would be to try to get that committee in place this spring, hopefully late February, March, that time frame, so that we can start moving forward with actually working on some of the, what they call the low-hanging fruit in that master plan, but making sure that it's a living document and that we're actually implementing some of the ideas that are in it. So that's to come in the spring, but that's the only thing I wanted to report on. Anyone, any other reports?
Nothing to report.
I had a meeting with Cindy Christensen and Dr. Huda, who's from Los Angeles, who I think Cindy might have mentioned at the meeting that we had. Had a very good conversation. She's a very, very intelligent woman, and kind of brought us up to date on what she is studying, which is called ultrafine particulate matter, and she has done some studies out in the West Coast, right around LAX, and found that this ultrafine, it's just particulate matter that comes from emissions, basically. It comes from car emissions, it comes from a lot of different things. But her study showed that around the Los Angeles airport, and for a period of about 8 to 12 miles thereabouts, there was about a 25% increase in this particulate matter. Now, this is not matter that's studied in most of the studies. The particulate matter that's studied, like in the the Department of Health report that was done over the 5 years, was a larger particulate matter. It was the PM 2.5 is what it's called.